Jasmine Thompson stepped onto the sprawling campus of Westbrook University with a mixture of excitement and nervousness in her heart. The large buildings with their stone facades looked intimidating, but she held her head high. This was her dream, to study at one of the country's most prestigious universities, and she had worked too hard to feel out of place now. At 18 years old, Jasmine was already used to being underestimated. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, she had always been the math girl in school. Her parents, her father a bus driver and her mother a nurse's aide, had always encouraged her talents, even when they didn't fully understand the complex problems she solved for fun. The weight of her backpack dug into her shoulders as she made her way to her first advanced calculus class. Inside, the lecture hall was grand, with rows of seats rising in a half-circle around a central stage where a thin, gray-haired professor stood preparing his notes. This was Dr. Harrington, known throughout the mathematics world for his brilliant research and throughout the student body for his harsh grading and even harsher comments. Jasmine chose a seat in the back row. She had learned long ago that being too visible sometimes invited unwanted attention. She watched as other students filed in, many of them chatting confidently about summer internships or family vacations in Europe. Most were white or Asian, and many of the men wore expensive-looking watches. Jasmine glanced down at her worn sneakers and second-hand laptop. "Good morning," Dr. Harrington began sharply at exactly 9 a.m. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus. If you're looking for basic calculus, that would be down the hall." His eyes scanned the room. "And I suspect some of you should be there instead." His gaze lingered momentarily on Jasmine before moving on. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but took a deep breath. She belonged here. As Dr. Harrington launched into his lecture, Jasmine noticed another older professor slip into the room and sit in a chair to the side. Dr. Klein, the department head, was observing today. She had read about his work too. The lecture moved quickly. While many students scrambled to take notes, Jasmine found herself easily following along. The concepts weren't new to her. Her uncle Marcus, a self-taught mathematician who worked as an electrician, had gone through these with her years ago. "You're a natural," Uncle Marcus used to tell her. "You see patterns where others see chaos." After class, Jasmine headed straight to her job at the campus coffee shop. Unlike many of her classmates, her scholarship only covered tuition. Books, room, and board came from her savings and what she could earn working 20 hours a week. Later that evening, as she made her way back to her small dorm room, Jasmine passed by the mathematics building. Most offices were dark, but she spotted Dr. Harrington and Dr. Klein still in the department lounge, talking over coffee. "The new freshman class seems promising," Dr. Klein was saying. "Most of them, perhaps," Dr. Harrington replied, his voice carrying through the partially open window. "Though I'm concerned about these diversity admissions lowering our standards. That girl in the back row, did you see her? Barely took any notes. Probably completely lost." Jasmine froze, knowing instantly he was talking about her. Her cheeks burned as she hurried past. Back in her room, she pulled out her calculus textbook and flipped past the assigned problems to the challenging ones at the chapter's end. Her roommate was out, probably at some freshman mixer. Jasmine didn't mind the quiet. As she worked through problem after problem, a familiar calm settled over her. Numbers had never judged her. Equations didn't care about her skin color or where she came from. Little did Dr. Harrington know, Jasmine Thompson wasn't just keeping up. She was already chapters ahead. 3 weeks into the semester, Jasmine had settled into a routine. Each morning, she would wake at 6, review her notes, attend classes, work her shift at the coffee shop, and then study late into the night. While other freshmen were making friends and attending parties, Jasmine was solving extra calculus problems that weren't even assigned. On this particular Wednesday morning, advanced calculus was packed. Word had spread that Dr. Harrington would be covering a particularly difficult section, and no one wanted to miss it. Jasmine slipped into her usual back row seat just as the clock struck 9. "Today we'll be applying L'Hopital's rule to more complex functions," Dr. Harrington announced, writing a string of symbols across the board. His chalk scratched against the blackboard as the room fell silent. Jasmine noticed Dr. Klein enter again, this time with another professor she didn't recognize. They sat at the back, observing the class with critical eyes. "Now, who can tell me how to approach this problem?" Dr. Harrington pointed to a complicated limit on the board. No hands went up. The silence grew uncomfortable as he scanned the room with narrowed eyes. Suddenly, his gaze landed on Jasmine. "Miss Thompson, since you seem so comfortable that you rarely take notes in my class, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding of this concept." The room turned to look at her. Jasmine felt her heart pounding. She knew the answer. It was similar to problems she had solved for fun in high school, but having all those eyes on her made her freeze. She began, her voice barely audible. "You would need to." "Speak up, Miss Thompson," Dr. Harrington said impatiently. "The entire class is waiting." "You would need to differentiate both the numerator and denominator," she said, her voice stronger now. "And then," Dr. Harrington pressed. "Then you would." Jasmine hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because her mind was racing too fast, seeing multiple approaches simultaneously. Before she could continue, Dr. Harrington sighed dramatically. "This is precisely why foundational preparation is so essential." He turned to the visiting professors. "Some students aren't ready for this level of mathematics, but our admissions department has different priorities these days." A few students snickered. Jasmine felt her cheeks burn as she sank lower in her seat. Perhaps someone else would like to attempt it. Dr. Harrington turned away from her. A tall, blonde student named Alex raised his hand and gave a partial answer. Dr. Harrington nodded encouragingly, helping him through the steps that Jasmine had been about to explain. After class, Jasmine hurried out, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She almost made it to the hallway when she overheard the visiting professor speaking to Dr. Klein. "These diversity initiatives are well-intentioned, but we can't lower our mathematical standards." That poor girl was completely out of her depth. Dr. Klein nodded. "Harrington thinks the same. Says she hardly takes notes and seems lost most of the time." What they didn't know was that Jasmine didn't take extensive notes because she already understood the material. Unlike her classmates, who frantically copied everything, she only noted new insights or approaches. That evening at the coffee shop, Jasmine's hands shook slightly as she made lattes and cappuccinos. The embarrassment still stung, but beneath it, something else was growing: determination. During her break, she pulled out a notebook and began writing, her pencil moving rapidly across the page. She had thought of a more elegant solution to Dr. Harrington's problem, one that connected L'Hopital's rule to a theorem they hadn't yet covered in class. "What are you working on?" asked her coworker, Maria. "Just some math," Jasmine replied quietly. "Looks complicated," Maria said, peering at the symbols and numbers. Jasmine smiled faintly. "It is, but that doesn't mean I can't do it." Later that night, as she walked back to her dorm under the glow of campus streetlights, Jasmine made a decision. She wouldn't speak up in class anymore, at least not yet. She would let her work speak for her when the time was right. What Dr. Harrington and the others didn't realize was that they had just lit a fire in her that wouldn't be easily extinguished. The mathematics building was nearly empty at 11:30 p.m. Most students had long returned to their dorms, and professors had gone home to their families. But in classroom 204, the lights remained on, illuminating a solitary figure. Jasmine stood before one of the large whiteboards, marker in hand, working through a series of complex equations. This had become her secret ritual over the past month. After finishing her coffee shop shift at 10:00 p.m., instead of going straight back to her dorm, she would slip into this unused classroom to work on advanced problems without interruption. "If you integrate both sides here," she whispered to herself, writing out steps in her neat, precise handwriting, "then the solution becomes much clearer." She stepped back to admire her work. A complete solution to a problem from Dr. Harrington's graduate-level textbook, one that wouldn't be covered in her class for months, if at all. The sound of a janitor's cart rolling down the hallway made her freeze. Quickly, she snapped a photo of her work with her phone, then erased the board. She had learned to be careful about leaving her calculations visible. The last thing she needed was for someone to accuse her of cheating or getting help from others. But tonight, she was a minute too slow. "Don't erase that on my account," said a deep voice from the doorway. Jasmine turned to see Mr. Washington, the night custodian, standing there with his cleaning cart. He was an older black man with kind eyes and gray hair at his temples. "I'm sorry," Jasmine said automatically. "I know I shouldn't be here so late." No rule against studying, Mr. Washington replied, entering the room. Been seeing your work on these boards for weeks now when I come to clean. Always wondered who was behind it. Jasmine looked down, suddenly shy. It's just extra practice. Mr. Washington glanced at what remained of her equations on the board before she finished erasing. That doesn't look like freshman calculus to me. That's graduate-level work. Surprised, Jasmine looked up. You know calculus? He smiled. 30 years cleaning this building, you pick things up. Used to sit in on classes when I could. Always had a mind for numbers. He tapped his temple. Never had the chance for college myself, but I know enough to recognize something special when I see it. For the first time in weeks, Jasmine felt seen. My uncle taught me. He never finished high school, but he's brilliant with math. He gave me old textbooks when I was 12. Mr. Washington nodded. So why the late-night sessions? Math department has study rooms. Jasmine hesitated before answering truthfully. Some of the professors think I don't belong here. I'd rather not give them more reasons to notice me. Understanding crossed Mr. Washington's face. Ah, I see. He was quiet for a moment. You know, I've cleaned Dr. Harrington's office for 15 years. Man's brilliant but narrow-minded. Thinks talent only looks one way. He gestured to the now blank whiteboard. But real genius, it comes from anywhere. Can't be boxed in. He reached into his cart and pulled out a set of keys. Second floor has a small conference room, number 237. Nobody uses it except for department meetings on Thursdays. Better lighting, more boards. He handed her a key. Just lock up when you're done and slip the key under my office door. B12 in the basement. Jasmine stared at the key in her palm. Why would you do this for me? Because 30 years ago, I was good with numbers too. Maybe someone should have done it for me. He smiled and turned his cart toward the door. Just promise me something? What's that? When you prove them all wrong, and you will, remember there are others coming behind you who'll need the same chance. After Mr. Washington left, Jasmine clutched the key tightly. In her other hand, she held her uncle's most recent letter, filled with encouragement and more problems to solve. Between lectures where she was ignored and evenings working for minimum wage, these midnight sessions were where she truly came alive. What Dr. Harrington and the mathematics department didn't realize was that while they were sleeping, Jasmine Thompson was advancing her understanding far beyond their curriculum, solving problems some of them would find challenging. And she was just getting started. Midterm season descended on Westbrook University like a heavy fog. Students filled the library at all hours, study groups formed in every corner of campus, and the coffee shop where Jasmine worked had never been busier. Despite her exhaustion from double shifts, Jasmine felt prepared for her advanced calculus exam. Her late-night sessions in room 237 had put her far ahead of the material. The day before the midterm, Dr. Harrington scheduled a special review session. The lecture hall was packed when Jasmine arrived, forcing her to take a seat near the front, a position she normally avoided. Tomorrow's examination will separate those who truly understand calculus from those who merely memorize formulas, Dr. Harrington announced, pacing before the blackboard. Today's review will focus on application problems similar to what you'll face. Dr. Klein sat in the corner, joined by two other professors from the department. Jasmine recognized one as Dr. Walsh, who taught the graduate seminar whose textbook she'd been studying in secret. For the first hour, Dr. Harrington reviewed concepts they covered, calling primarily on male students to answer questions. When girls raised their hands, he often acknowledged them with shorter, simpler problems. Jasmine kept her hand down, taking minimal notes and focusing instead on the more difficult examples. Let's try something more challenging, Dr. Harrington said, writing a complex optimization problem on the board. This represents the type of thinking required to earn an A in this course. The room fell silent as students copied the problem. Jasmine immediately recognized it as a variation of one she'd solved during her midnight sessions. Without thinking, she began to write the solution in her notebook. Would anyone like to attempt this? Dr. Harrington asked, his tone suggesting he expected no volunteers. Before she could stop herself, Jasmine raised her hand. Dr. Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. Ms. Thompson, this is unexpected. Please, come to the board. Jasmine's heart pounded as she walked to the front of the room. She could feel everyone watching her. She began writing, explaining her approach as she went. First, I'll identify the function to be optimized and the constraints. Stop, Dr. Harrington interrupted after just a few steps. Your setup is already flawed. You're approaching this as a simple maximization problem. Yes, because if we transform the constraint, Jasmine tried to continue. Miss Thompson, you're skipping fundamental steps, he cut in again. This is precisely the type of superficial understanding I was warning about. He turned to the visiting professors. Notice how she's attempting to apply a formula without understanding the underlying principles. Jasmine felt her face growing hot. But I do understand, if you'll let me finish. The problem with mathematics education today, Dr. Harrington continued as if she hadn't spoken, is that we rush students through basics before they're ready for advanced concepts. Dr. Walsh leaned forward. Perhaps she would be more comfortable in introductory calculus. Not everyone is suited for this track. Several students snickered. Jasmine stood frozen at the board, marker still in hand, her half-completed solution visible to everyone. Thank you, Ms. Thompson, Dr. Harrington said dismissively. You can take your seat now. Let me demonstrate the correct approach. As she returned to her seat, Jasmine noticed that her hands were shaking. Dr. Harrington proceeded to solve the problem using almost the exact method she had been attempting to show, but with more explanation of each step. By the end, his solution matched where hers had been heading. When the session ended, Jasmine gathered her things quickly, keeping her head down as tears threatened to spill. She pushed past other students, ignoring their stares. Outside, the cool autumn air hit her face. She walked quickly across campus, not toward her dorm but toward the mathematics building. By the time she reached room 237, tears were streaming down her face. Inside, she locked the door, dropped her backpack, and faced the whiteboard. Through her tears, she began to write, starting with the problem Dr. Harrington had given them. But this time, she didn't stop. She solved it completely, then moved on to a harder version, then another. By midnight, every whiteboard in the room was filled with her calculations. This was no longer about proving herself to Dr. Harrington or anyone else. It was about proving something to herself. She would not be broken. The midterm results were posted outside Dr. Harrington's office a week later. Students gathered around the list, searching for their student ID numbers among the scores. Jasmine hung back, waiting for the crowd to thin before approaching. When she finally saw her number, she blinked twice to make sure she was reading correctly. 98/100ths, the highest score in the class. Impossible, she heard someone mutter nearby. It was Alex, the blonde student who often answered questions in class. Thompson got a 98? There must be a mistake. Jasmine slipped away before he could see her, a small smile playing on her lips. Let them think what they wanted. The numbers spoke for themselves. Later that afternoon, as she walked through the mathematics building to her secret study room, Jasmine noticed a bright yellow flyer on the bulletin board. ANNULPRINCET Mathematics CHALLNG 5 Unsolved Problems. 1 week to submit. Winner presents at the Northeast Mathematics Conference. Anonymous submissions only, student ID numbers required. Below the announcement were 5 mathematical problems that made even advanced calculus look simple. Jasmine read through them, her heart beating faster with each one. The third problem particularly caught her eye, a complex optimization scenario involving multiple variables and constraints. Planning to enter? Jasmine jumped at the voice behind her. It was Dr. Walsh, the professor who had suggested she drop down to a lower class during the review session. I was just looking, Jasmine said quietly. Dr. Walsh smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. These problems are designed for our top students, usually seniors with research experience. But you're welcome to try. She walked away, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. That night in room 237, Jasmine couldn't focus on her usual practice. The 5 challenge problems kept pulling at her mind. She wrote them out on the whiteboard, staring at them for nearly an hour. What would Uncle Marcus say? She whispered to herself. Her uncle had always taught her to look for patterns where others saw chaos. She focused on the third problem, the one that had initially caught her attention. It reminded her of something she'd worked on with her uncle last summer, but far more complex. Picking up a blue marker, she began breaking it down, step by step. For the next 5 days, Jasmine lived and breathed the challenge problems. She cut back her coffee shop hours, claiming illness. She skipped meals. She slept only when exhaustion overtook her. Mr. Washington brought her sandwiches from the cafeteria, concerned about how thin she was looking. "You don't have to prove anything to those professors," he told her one night. "I'm not doing it for them," Jasmine replied, her eyes never leaving the board. "I'm doing it for me." By day 5, she had workable solutions for 4 of the 5 problems. The third one, which she had started with, had evolved into something she was genuinely proud of, an elegant approach that connected concepts from advanced calculus, linear algebra, and even some topology she'd studied on her own. On the submission deadline, Jasmine typed up her solutions, careful to show every step of her thinking. She included detailed explanations of her approach, knowing that innovation often needed justification. Where traditional methods failed, she developed new ones, footnoting her reasoning. At 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the deadline, she submitted her solutions online. The form asked only for her student ID number, 7294. As she woke back to her dorm that night, Jasmine felt lighter than she had in months. Whatever the outcome, she had pushed herself beyond what she thought possible. She had created something original, something truly her own. What she didn't know was that across campus, in the mathematics department, a committee was already gathering to review the anonymous submissions, and that her solutions would soon send shockwaves through their carefully ordered world. The mathematics department conference room buzzed with energy as 5 professors sat around a large oak table. Papers were spread everywhere, coffee cups littered the surface, and the whiteboard was filled with notes. The judging committee for the Princeton Westbrook Mathematics Challenge had been reviewing submissions for 3 days. "Let's discuss student #7294 again," said Dr. Klein, lifting a packet of papers. "I've gone through these solutions multiple times, and they're unlike anything I've seen from an undergraduate." Dr. Harrington frowned, leaning forward to peer at the papers. "The approach to problem 3 is particularly interesting. It combines elements of multivariable calculus with discrete optimization in a way I haven't seen before." "Who do you think it is?" asked Dr. Walsh. "One of Chen's senior research students? Or maybe that Miller boy from the honors program?" "The handwriting doesn't match any of my advanced students," said Dr. Chen, the youngest professor on the committee. "But whoever it is has an intuitive understanding of mathematical relationships that's quite remarkable." Dr. Harrington nodded reluctantly. "The solution to problem 4 alone demonstrates a level of creativity approaching genius. I'd be proud to present work of this caliber myself." After another hour of deliberation, the committee reached a unanimous decision. Student #7294 would be declared the winner and would represent Westbrook at the Northeast Mathematics Conference in 2 weeks. "Time to find out who our mystery mathematician is," said Dr. Klein, turning to his computer. He entered the student ID into the university database while the others gathered around. The screen loaded, and a collective gasp filled the room. "Jasmine Thompson, the freshman?" Dr. Walsh said in disbelief. Dr. Harrington stared at the screen, his face pale. "That can't be right. She's barely keeping up in my class. She hardly takes notes." "According to her midterm, she's not just keeping up. She's leading the class," Dr. Chen pointed out. "And these solutions," he tapped the papers, "these aren't the work of someone who's struggling." "Perhaps we should verify this isn't a mistake," suggested Dr. Walsh. "She could have had help, or perhaps," interrupted Dr. Chen, "we should consider that we've misjudged Ms. Thompson." The room fell silent as the implication of his words sank in. The next morning, Jasmine was refilling the sugar containers at the coffee shop when her phone buzzed with an email notification. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. "Dear Ms. Thompson, congratulations. Your submission to the Princeton Westbrook Mathematics Challenge has been selected as this year's winner. Your solutions demonstrated exceptional creativity and mathematical insight. As the winner, you will present your work at the Northeast Mathematics Conference on November 15th. Please contact Dr. Klein immediately to discuss preparation for this prestigious opportunity. Sincerely, the Mathematics Department." Jasmine read the email 3 times, her hands shaking. She had won. Actually won. When her shift ended, she practically ran across campus to Dr. Klein's office. Outside his door, She paused, hearing voices inside. Still find it hard to believe, Dr. Harrington was saying. She's shown no indication of this level of ability in class. Perhaps because you never gave her the opportunity to show it, replied a voice Jasmine didn't recognize. She knocked softly, and the room went quiet. Come in, called Dr. Klein. Jasmine opened the door to find Dr. Klein, Dr. Harrington, and a woman she didn't know, all staring at her with new eyes. Miss Thompson, Dr. Klein stood, extending his hand. Congratulations on your remarkable achievement. We were just discussing your innovative solution to problem 3. Thank you, she said quietly, shaking his hand. This is Professor Rivera from Princeton University, Dr. Klein continued, gesturing to the woman. She's one of the conference organizers and was particularly impressed by your work. The mathematical community is always excited to discover new talent, Professor Rivera said warmly. We're looking forward to your presentation. Dr. Harrington remained seated, his expression unreadable, but for the first time, when he looked at Jasmine, he actually saw her. As she left the office 30 minutes later, Jasmine felt a strange mix of validation and nervousness. The secret midnight mathematician was secret no more. Now she would have to stand before hundreds of mathematicians and prove that her solutions weren't a fluke, that Jasmine Thompson truly belonged in their world. The Northeast Mathematics Conference was held in a grand hotel ballroom that had been transformed into an academic arena. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform where a podium stood beside a large projection screen. By 2:00 p.m., the room was filled with mathematics professors, graduate students, and industry professionals from across the region. Jasmine sat in the front row, reviewing her notes one last time. She had spent the past 2 weeks preparing for this presentation, practicing in front of Mr. Washington and even video calling her uncle for feedback. Professor Rivera from Princeton had helped refine her slides, impressed by Jasmine's natural ability to explain complex concepts. In the row behind her sat Dr. Harrington, Dr. Klein, and several other Westbrook professors. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at Jasmine. Even if her solutions were correct, presenting mathematical work requires a different skill set entirely, Dr. Walsh whispered to Dr. Harrington. This could be quite uncomfortable to watch. Dr. Harrington nodded, though he looked less certain than he had weeks ago. At precisely 2:15 p.m., the conference chair approached the podium. Our next presenter represents Westbrook University as this year's winner of the Princeton Westbrook Mathematics Challenge. Please welcome freshman student Jasmine Thompson, presenting her solution to multivariable optimization under dynamic constraints. A polite applause filled the room as Jasmine stood and walked to the podium. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her steps were steady. She connected her laptop to the projector, and her first slide appeared on the screen. Good afternoon, she began, her voice quiet but clear. Traditional approaches to this class of problems rely heavily on Lagrangian multipliers with fixed constraints. Today, I'd like to show you a different way of thinking about these systems. As she moved through her presentation, something remarkable happened. Her nervousness faded, replaced by the same joy she felt during her midnight sessions in room 237. Mathematics had always been her true language, and now she was simply sharing a conversation she'd been having with herself for weeks. She drew connections between concepts that most undergraduates wouldn't encounter until their 3rd or 4th year. When she reached the core insight of her solution, a novel approach that treated the constraints themselves as variables within a higher dimensional space, she paused to gauge the room's reaction. Many were leaning forward in their seats. Some were frantically taking notes. In the 3rd row, an elderly professor with wild white hair was nodding vigorously, a smile spreading across his face. This allows us to transform what appears to be an unsolvable problem into something elegant and accessible, Jasmine explained, writing out the key equations on a whiteboard beside her slides. Her chalk moved confidently across the board, just as it had during those late nights alone. When she finished her explanation, she turned to face the audience. Are there any questions? Hands shot up across the room. For the next 20 minutes, Jasmine fielded complex questions with remarkable poise. When one professor challenged a particular step in her reasoning, she acknowledged the concern and walked him through her thought process until understanding dawned on his face. Remarkable, he said, sitting down. Simply remarkable. In the front row, Professor Rivera was beaming. Behind her, Dr. Harrington sat with an expression of stunned disbelief that slowly transformed into reluctant admiration. The final question came from the white-haired professor who had been nodding earlier. Ms. Thompson, have you considered the implications of your approach for non-convex optimization problems in machine learning? I have, actually, Jasmine replied, smiling. If we extend the dimensional transformation I described to include stochastic variables, we could potentially address some of the gradient vanishing problems in deep neural networks. The professor's eyebrows shot up, and he broke into a wide grin. I would very much like to discuss this further with you. I'm David Steinberg from MIT. As the session ended, Jasmine was surrounded by mathematicians eager to speak with her. Business cards were pressed into her hands. Graduate programs were mentioned. Through the crowd, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Harrington and the other Westbrook professors, watching from a distance, their earlier skepticism replaced by a new awareness. They had finally seen what Jasmine had always known, that brilliance comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest student in the back row might just be the one with the most to teach. Spring semester at Westbrook University felt different for Jasmine Thompson. She no longer sat in the back row of her mathematics classes. She no longer hid her abilities. And she no longer worked late nights at the coffee shop. Instead, she had been offered a paid research assistant position in the mathematics department. The conference presentation had changed everything. News of the freshman calculus prodigy had spread across campus, inspiring whispered conversations whenever she walked through the mathematics building. But more importantly, it had changed how Jasmine saw herself. On a bright April morning, Jasmine stood before a classroom of 30 high school students from her old neighborhood in Detroit. They had been bused to Westbrook for a special mathematics enrichment day that she had organized with help from the university's outreach office. Mathematics isn't just about getting the right answer, she told them, moving confidently around the front of the room. It's about seeing patterns that others miss. It's about finding your own path to the solution. Among the visiting teachers, she spotted her old high school calculus teacher, Mrs. Bennett, who had first recognized Jasmine's talent years ago. The woman dabbed at her eyes, clearly emotional to see her former student commanding the room with such authority. Many of you might feel that certain fields aren't meant for people who look like us, Jasmine continued. I felt that way too, but I was wrong. And anyone who tells you otherwise is also wrong. After the session, as the students filed out for lunch, Dr. Harrington appeared in the doorway. In the months since the conference, the relationship had evolved into something neither could have predicted. A genuine, if sometimes awkward, mentorship. That was well done, Miss Thompson, he said, approaching her as she gathered her materials. You have a gift for teaching. Thank you, she replied. There was still a formality between them, but the hostility was gone. I've been meaning to speak with you about next year, he continued. Dr. Steinberg from MIT has been calling me weekly about you, and Princeton is apparently preparing some sort of special scholarship. Jasmine smiled. I know. They've both been in touch. And? Dr. Harrington asked, a hint of concern in his voice that would have been unimaginable months earlier. I'm staying at Westbrook, she said firmly. There's important work to be done here. Dr. Harrington looked surprised but pleased. May I ask what led to that decision? Jasmine considered her answer carefully. The mathematics is the same wherever I go, but here I can change more than equations. She gestured toward the window, where the high school students could be seen crossing the quad. Those kids need to see someone like me succeeding in places like this. And, she paused, meeting his eyes directly, this department needs to remember that brilliance doesn't always look or sound the way they expect. Dr. Harrington nodded slowly, a flush of embarrassment coloring his cheeks. We're learning that lesson, thanks to you. He cleared his throat. The department has approved your proposal for the summer mentorship program, by the way. Full funding. Later that afternoon, Jasmine walked through the mathematics building, passing room 237, her old secret study space. She no longer needed to hide there. She now had her own small office as a research assistant. But she still stopped to peek inside, smiling at the memories. Mr. Washington was buffing the floor nearby. He looked up and grinned when he saw her. How's our math star today? He asked. Just trying to keep up with my own schedule, she laughed. The mentorship program got approved. Of course it did, he said proudly. You're changing things around here. one calculation at a time. As Jasmine walked away, her phone buzzed with a text from her Uncle Marcus. "Got your letter. So proud I could burst." Those professors had no idea who they were dealing with, did they? Jasmine smiled, typing back, "No, they didn't. But they do now." Outside, spring sunshine bathed the campus in golden light. Students lounged on the grass, studying and chatting. Jasmine spotted a young black girl sitting alone under a tree, deeply focused on a textbook. She changed direction and walked toward her. "Advanced physics?" Jasmine asked, noting the book's cover. The girl looked up, startled. "Yes, I'm just a freshman, but I'm trying to get ahead." Jasmine sat down beside her. "Let me tell you a story about getting ahead," she began, "and about who gets to decide what brilliance looks like."